want you to give all, or, excuse me, I will give you all the help I can, he added. What caused Chester Arthur to change himself so drastically from a corrupt hack of political machines into a rather virtuous and competent president? The answer, in short, is the presidency itself. The period between Garfield's shooting and his death, Arthur realized the importance and the gravity of the office which he was about to take. It was an age where corruption was rampant, almost accepted in politics. But no president before him had ever entered the White House so mistrusted. The nation had never been so worried about its vice president. Arthur's record as president indicates that he was not comfortable with the record he had made for himself up until that point. The obvious catalyst for this change was the presidential office itself. Perhaps Arthur was conscious of how history would perceive him. He never actually tells specific reasons for his transformation, but more likely Arthur realized that as president, his actions no longer had effects on just his political machine, or on just the state of New York. As president, his actions had implications for each one of the nation's 50 million citizens. Arthur was not a stupid man. He was impressed by the responsibility which had been put upon his shoulders by Garfield's murder. But he was changed by it. And though these are my findings, this wasn't really the question I initially set out to answer. When I first began to think about my topic for 485 2 years ago, I think I was a bit of a crusader, really. I wanted to resurrect Arthur's reputation. Apparently, Dr. Lubin, who was here, is here? Yes. Apparently, Dr. Lubin and I share an affinity for the underdog and the understudied, as we discussed last night. I thought, in short, that Mount Rushmore needed a new face, which I tried unsuccessfully to Photoshop for the sake of this PowerPoint. I realized eventually that simply this couldn't be done. Arthur was a good president, to be sure, but in avoiding anachronism, I realized that he lived in an era which expected rather little of their presidents. In a way, Arthur's reputation has suffered from anachronism as well. We still reflect upon the unsavory elements of his career as unsavory, and machine politics really don't look good at any point in history. But we expect so much more of our presidents today. They must be leaders of the executive and legislative branches. They must be media darlings. They must play basketball. They must travel the world and look good doing it. Gilded Age presidents didn't really need to do those things. They needed to make an annual speech, veto the occasional bill if they saw fit. There were ribbon cuttings and balls to host, but for the most part, a president was meant to passively sit and really await roles to come to him. Arthur actually did a very good job of that. So eventually I realized that an inquest into the change that overtook President Arthur was actually a much more interesting question. We rarely tolerate political changes apart from our politicians, and Arthur's stalwarts certainly didn't tolerate his. Arthur's example, though, is a rare instance of people truly supporting a politician's about face. Today we usually call this flip-flopping or wishy-washiness, but in Arthur's case, it sort of borders on the heroic, it seems. Part of my enjoyment of this project came from the similarities I was able to draw between Arthur's age and today. Born as he was about 30 miles from here in Fairfield, Vermont, a really tiny town in northern Vermont, a cadre of muckraking journalists launched a campaign against Vice President Arthur, which indicated he was actually born in Quebec. Of course, this would make him constitutionally ineligible for either vice president or president. Historians today understand these claims to be false, but I really can't help draw some similarities between Arthur's controversy and the birther controversy, which President Obama's opponents have leveled at him today. I noticed, too, the conspicuous lack of bipartisanship which characterized Washington in the 1880s just as badly as it does today, if not worse, in fact. Also of note are Arthur's successful efforts to argue for an African-American woman's right to ride a streetcar when he was a lawyer in the 1850s. Again, this sounds oddly familiar to a particular Rosa Parks incident of the 1950s. I think it is probably cliche to say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But on the other hand, I think that's half the fun of studying history. And though enjoyable, I really can't say that this has been an easy process. In the first place, the night before Arthur died, he called in his manservant, handed over all of his personal letters that he had in his possession, dumped them into a barrel, and had his manservant light them on fire. That makes my job very difficult. Primary source evidence is therefore pretty limited. And historiography has really advanced a little over the years. Reeves's 35-year-old book remains the most comprehensive study on Arthur ever undertaken. This shockingly small canon of historiographic work has led me away from historiography by necessity and deep into the small amount of remaining primary source material. It's been a challenging exercise, but really excellent for a student historian to try and test his method. I hope it's worked. Really, it's been a welcome challenge to present some new work and a new angle on who was really an understudied president. I do get one question quite a bit, so I'll answer it ahead of time. Why did I end up looking at Chester Arthur in the first place? Well, in my hometown, I'm about as surrounded by Chester Arthur as one really can be. This building, which is now the post office for Newtonville, New York, which, except for a few of you, probably never heard of, this was the building in which Chester Arthur's father, who was a reverend, actually once preached. This was his chapel, and it's now a post office. On the next slide. This is Chester Arthur's grave at Albany Rural Cemetery in Menands. Both of these sites are within about 6 miles of my house. When I came here, my classwork in Dr. Moran's honor seminar on the presidents really sort of re-piqued my curiosity about Chester Arthur. But I really suppose I owe my fate most to my late grandfather. As a young man, he used to work here in Albany Rural Cemetery, cleaning graves, including Arthur's. To the end of his days, he insisted on telling me, "You know, Brett, I used to work over the president." So really, it was bad humor that got me to Chester Arthur. I'm glad it did. So, thank you.
Other than him retreating during those 3 months of deep thought about the presidency, were there any key people around him as aides that encouraged him in this direction?
He received a lot of letters from people from all ends of the spectrum. I should mention as well that his wife actually died just a few months before he became vice president. This sort of sent him into a deep and prolonged period of mourning. When he became president, I haven't seen it myself, but apparently there's a church that you can see from his chambers in the White House, and within that church he had a stained glass window installed in the image of his wife so he could look at her every night. And there were some rather juicy rumors that the president used to have fresh flowers put by the picture of a woman every day, and the journalists shut up pretty quickly when they realized that was his late wife he was putting flowers next to. So in that way, it's almost as if someone wasn't around him. I think that sort of refocused him. He had spent a lot of his life spending late nights with his political allies, people like that, and away from his wife and family. So I think that had an effect on him. And then he did receive letters from different sectors suggesting who he should pick for his cabinet, or suggesting pieces of legislation that he should try and enact. And in a way, I think he got so much material from so many different places that it sort of led him to this middle ground, which he eventually struck on, which was sort of reform and virtuousness. Yeah, Dr. Newhouse?
Is there any evidence that, if you reminded me with the church, is there any evidence that there was a kind of religious conviction or aspect?
Well, his father was a preacher, a fairly radical preacher, actually. His father, Arthur was born in Fairfield. They also lived in Jericho, Waterville, Burlington, and then about 5 or 6 different, Anthony, he was in Greenwich, I think, right? And then 5 or 6 different places around the capital region of New York. They moved around so much because Arthur's father was a pretty rabid abolitionist, and it was pretty radical, and not a lot of congregations really appreciated that. So I don't know that there are very strong religious elements in Arthur's character particularly, but there are some, especially early in his life, there are some abolitionist aspects which we can look at, and I think that sort of comes from his father, and in a way from religion. Yeah.
Have you heard of Sean Willets? He's an early American historian.
What was his name?
Sean Willets.
No, I haven't.
Well, he's an early American historian. But he also was very active in the fight against impeaching President Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he wrote is that he almost blames the attempt to impeach the attempt to impeach President Johnson for almost they said this is why almost no Americans can name anybody between President Lincoln any presidents between President Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
So I was wondering if that was part of your paper, the fact that you mentioned the sort of what people expect from Gilded Age presidents, and that it was an